We're producing an extra episode this month thanks to the support of our Campaign Trend Insiders. If you want to join them and get even more insights and analysis, visit campaigntrend.com/join and subscribe for just $10 per month.
I think we still have that linear mindset that, election day is when people are going to decide.
Welcome to the Campaign Trend Podcast, where you are joining in on a conversation with the entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. I'm your host, Eric Wilson. We're talking with Chris Faulkner, who is a senior national strategist at Majority Strategies, one of the biggest consulting firms in the political space. Chris spent almost a decade as a Marine before getting into politics, and he has worked on a lot of campaigns. In this episode, we dive further into the mechanics and strategy around early voting and vote by mail in the 2024 election. All right, before we dive in, I want to make sure we cover some abbreviations and jargon you'll hear during our discussion. So AB refers to absentee ballots, EV refers to early voting, VBM is short for vote by mail, and we'll often use the combined term ABEV to refer to all voting before Election Day, whether that's in person or via mail. And then finally, ABEV Chase is the phrase we use to describe reaching out to voters to make sure they turn in their mail-in ballots. So with that out of the way, I think we can have a real in-the-weeds discussion here. So Chris, in 2020, we saw significant changes to voting procedures due to COVID-19 pandemic. And since then, several states have modified their voting laws. There have been some changes, especially in response to election integrity. Can you give us an overview of the current landscape of early voting and vote by mail across the country? I mean, obviously we can't go state by state, but what are some changes that people need to be aware of here in 2024?
The landscape has obviously changed dramatically since COVID. All of us do a lot more things at home or do them remotely now than we used to, and voting is no different than that. You know, we obviously saw record numbers of early voting in the presidential election in 2020, and they'll obviously, I think, be surpassed this year by the numbers we're seeing. Some things to keep in mind. Some states, that early window for voting or voting through the mail can be as much as 6 weeks. In some states, it's only 2 weeks. Whatever the length, though, is, I think people should remember that the people that are returning their ballots in these first week or the first couple of days, I'll call them super voters, especially if they're not actually voting in the mail, but if they're actually voting in person. These are people that are probably average age 150 and have never missed an election in their lives.
Since voting for William Henry Harrison.
Exactly. And so I think that sometimes there is this fear. And believe me, I would much rather have all this stuff ready to go, but inevitably, things happen with campaigns and people get behind the 8 ball on pictures or fundraising or whatever. And so there's this, oh my gosh, well, we missed our window to, talk to voters. Yes and no. I don't think there's a whole lot of persuadable voters that are voting in the first week. Let's put it that way.
And I don't want to call you old, Chris, but you've been in this quite some time. So how has that growth of early voting changed the way campaigns are conducted compared to when you first started?
Yeah, I ran my first congressional race in 2000, and I even had an email address, so it felt super cool. Now, sometimes I wish I didn't have an email address or even a cell phone number. But if I get one more text, I definitely want to throw my cell phone through the window.
Yeah, it's getting out of control.
Yeah. But, back then, and this was in Indiana, we had pretty stringent absentee rules. You had to have you were either in jail or the hospital or something like that. And so absentee voting was 4 or 5% of total votes cast. That was 24 years ago. And how much that's changed, I'll use Indiana as an example. Whereas in, like I said, 2000, you're talking maybe 4% of people voting prior to election day, either in person or absentee. And then today, where more than in the state, depending on the election, more than half those ballots are cast before election day. Now, there still is a big clog there at the end. And I'm not saying it's all spread out evenly, because it's absolutely not, but it's dramatically different. And our voter contact and, whether it's grassroots or whether it's paid, I think we have to take those things into account. And from a planning perspective, I usually recommend to clients that you kind of put your early voters into tranches, if possible. If you can find out, some states you can actually get dates of when they turn their ballot in previously. So you can kind of put them in a bucket and say, okay, well, like this first bucket is the people that are voting the first week. They're clearly, the most partisan and probably not persuadable. But you can stage your mailings, your advertisings, if you want to get really nuanced and niche about it, you could do that. I actually just got updated numbers right before I jumped on the phone. And so I can tell you that there have been 369,546 ballots cast already. That is just 7 states. And
the 7 states that have started.
Yeah. As of September 27th.
Yeah.
And of those, 225,952 are early and the rest are absentee. So that's not quite a 2-to-1, but roughly 2-to-1 is what you're, going to see nationally. And so like basically Virginia is like way ahead of everybody. Virginia already has 224,000 votes cast. And the next closest to that is North Carolina with 3,400. So whatever they're doing to process votes in Virginia, they're doing it very efficiently.
Well, we have so many elections, we've got to get it right, or we won't be done counting before the next election starts. Chris, you raise a really good point here, which is we focus a lot, certainly on this podcast, about the disruption of technology and how campaigns have to change. But the point you're making here is that in the 20 years that you've been doing this, you've had a complete sea change in how voters cast their ballot. And so we're certainly making adjustments in strategy on our side, but I don't think we've fully embraced or come to terms with the way elections are run have changed and our strategy needs to be different. So talk to us about how are you getting this data? And is there anything that a campaign or a party can do to gauge how they're performing? Do we know who's winning yet?
It depends on the state, obviously, but because I want to say there's been some new laws passed to protect voter privacy. And especially in a year like this, where you're going to see some really epic, vote chasing going on by a lot of outside party groups, both on the left and the right. And so, if you're that guy, in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, that, you and your wife haven't returned your ballots yet, you could have people driving up to your house every day, like, hey, bud, you going to turn those things in? We're literally waiting on you. So I think that the way that campaigns approach this often is not as nuanced as they could be. Anytime you introduce any kind of nuance or trying to be, too cute with stuff, sometimes it's easy to screw it up. So I understand why, but I think we still have that linear mindset that, election day is when people are going to decide. And that's actually somewhat true, I believe, based on the fact that the people that are voting with those mail ballots, or if they're going in person, they're probably not undecided, or they're probably more likely to be undecided than not if they're voting in that last week. So, I mean, it's just less about, the individual.
They
Tuesday
haven't learned enough about the
is,
candidates in the last 2 years. Yeah, right.
Well, and that's what we get with presidential elections, right? We get low information, low propensity voters that are all of a sudden are waking up and being like, what? There's an election? What day? Is that Thursday or Tuesday? When is that?
Right.
It's been really interesting. Somebody shared with me some crosstabs nationally. So traditionally, when we think about just kind of numbers and metrics in terms of planning, there are more Democrats than there are Republicans in the country. That's just fact, right? And in some states, there's a lot more Democrats than there are Republicans in those individual states. And for Republicans, turnout is very, very important. But I believe for Democrats, it's life and death, right?
Right.
And because they have more of the low information and low propensity voters just by percentage in most of their places, they have to do an exceptional job of trying to turn out those bottom end voters. Now, the wrinkle that's been thrown into it this year is, as again, President Trump brings chaos, to everything wherever he goes. And all of a sudden, he makes this comment about, well, hey, maybe we shouldn't have a federal tax on tips. And people like, my son, who's a barista, is like, what? Like he would never.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, voting for Donald Trump is not in his top 1,000 things he wants to do. But when he heard like they weren't going to tax tips, he was like, well, hey, maybe I'll consider it.
Yeah.
And I think that is very indicative of a lot of times when it comes to political messaging. We still think that everybody's driven by some sort of mad ideological glaze, when it comes to undecided voters, we still need to remember, like, there's still a lot of, what's in it for me? People will ask me sometimes, like, why are you a Republican? Like, it's because you believe in this or believe. I said, honestly, no. I'm a Republican because when I was 10 years old, my stepdad came home and he bought me a brand new bike. And I said, and I'm the oldest of 4 boys. It wasn't, my birthday. It wasn't Christmas. And I was like, what's this for? And he said, well, today's the day that Ronald Reagan gave the military a 12% pay increase. So I want you to remember this day and always remember that Ronald Reagan is a great man. And so at 10 years old, man, my vote was bought.
Kind of your rosebud moment. Yeah.
And so I think that as we're considering our messaging and we're doing these things, we have to remember this. It's less about the candidates and more about, these working class voters that are seeing, their income grow at an anemic rate while their cost of living is going through the roof. And, that's going to be a really interesting demographic to see how they turn out.
It goes to the differentiators that we see between demographics of who votes when. And so to your point, the early vote is mostly about making sure that our side, our partisans who might not be as regular voters, are casting their ballots. And so how should messaging differ for early voters compared to those voting on election day? And how do you keep that separate? I mean, you're talking to maybe 3-4 different audiences at once.
No, absolutely. And, let's take aside primaries for a moment. Primaries, obviously the early voting still takes place and you're dealing with people that are obviously much more partisan because they're voting in a primary.
Right.
And you need to consider those things. There are a lot less persuadables, depending on the variables of the race. But when it comes to the general election, I think, there's different schools of thought on this. There are some schools of thought that say, well, we need to try and cannibalize all the voters we know we're going to get anyway. Like, let's get them in the bank. Like, I know this guy's going to vote for us eventually, but we got to get him in the bank in the first week. Or there's the, hey, let me bombard this person and build to a crescendo so they vote in the last week. I wouldn't claim any kind of, special insight that one of those is somehow better than another. And there aren't always direct overlays in terms of like differentiation of issues between these different groups. Sometimes the same message, depending on what your survey and your modeling says, the same message may be just as applicable for the last group as it was for the first group. It'll be often very, particular and specific to the race that you're involved in.
You're listening to the Campaign Trend Podcast. I'm speaking with Chris Faulkner from Majority Strategies about early voting and absentee ballot strategies. So, Chris, we used to have the 72-hour plan, but early voting has obviously changed that with half of people voting before that window. What's the best approach for a campaign to time and structure its early vote strategy, looking at the dates and things like that? Obviously, it's going to vary state by state, but what are some of the factors that you take into consideration?
Obviously, there's 100 different opinions on this, and mine's necessarily not more valid than someone else's. But I generally like to have at least some information before voters in front of their getting some impressions before they're casting that ballot. Whether it's a combination of mail and digital, maybe text or something like that. I'm agnostic about the medium as much as, I'd like them to have some messaging, especially if you're talking like a state legislative race, right? Where people are like, oh yeah, hell yeah, I'm voting for Donald Trump. And then I'm voting for, Mike Rogers for U.S. Senate. Well, who are you voting for state rep? I don't know. I have no idea who that, I have no idea who that guy is.
We want to make sure that they recognize that name before mailing the ballot in. Yeah.
Yeah, because in some states they don't have party preference or recognition on there, and it does confuse some voters. People always like to say I vote for the person, not the party, and all that baloney, which is true maybe for the top two, but for the rest of it, you're usually just going with whatever team you're usually comfortable with, because nobody tends to know who the presiding judge of Superior Court number 4 or the what's the one we used to vote on in California? The Community College Chancellor's Board or something like that. Like, how the hell do I know?
Really exciting stuff.
Yeah.
Florida has like soil and water commissioners and tend to be actually really important.
Well, yeah. Florida also has the Mosquito Board Control Commissioner, which is a big deal.
And so your strategy then as a campaigner, let's say for down ballot, you basically want to have some name recognition. So when that person does go to vote, they've seen your name before, however that happens. And so I guess we now have to do that instead of that 72-hour period where we could just cram it all in. We've got to start spacing that out like a week before ballots drop or early voting starts.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the planning starts months and months in advance, but I think our vote of contact, obviously it depends on the budget, but your voter contact cadence needs to start before people have their ballots in hand. And you can save money, obviously, by targeting a smaller audience of people that are likely early voters versus people that are election day voters. And maybe within your polling, you have some crosstabs that say, one group prefers this message over another. But the other thing, like as I said earlier, the people that are voting early, they tend to be older. I would imagine if somebody who is a giant nerd who wanted to do this, you could plot on an Excel chart the people that turn their ballot in first and the people that turn their ballot in last. And I guarantee you there's a correlation in age.
I bet that's right. And one of the important things here, I guess, in order to be able to figure out the timing is that data work and making sure that you're identifying people. And so the people who, are identified as supporters, you want to get them to bank their votes early. I was reading a study earlier this week that looked at a few elections and found that wind actually impacted how people voted. So they were going to go vote, but in places where it was windier, they voted more one way versus the places where there was less wind, they voted a different way. And so as a campaign strategist, this tells me we need to make sure that we bank those votes that are reliably ours when people can do that instead of letting it be determined by the weather. What kind of data are we looking at? So obviously we've got the voter file. We've got whatever ID work the campaign has been able to get. What are some other data sources that campaigns are looking at to inform their ABEV chase strategy?
Generally, we're getting, and a lot of states have gotten a lot more easy to work with in terms of downloading that to us on a very timely basis. And then people have to remember, though, too, like if it's, today's Friday. So I have this list in front of me right now of people that have already returned ballots in Virginia. And so I'm doing a statewide mailing in Virginia. Okay, well, I better make sure I purge my list so I'm not mailing people that have already returned ballots.
Right.
And I there's a lot of really good people in our industry, as you know, but everyone makes mistakes. Everyone gets lazy. And if you're, listening to this, you should absolutely be making sure that people are bouncing their lists off that EV list so that you're not wasting postage. Especially, good Lord, postage is so freaking expensive now.
Yeah, and not just mail, but your text message list, your digital advertising,
all your contacts,
canvassing.
Yeah.
They voted. You can't talk to them anymore.
I think there's a second step to that, though, that I've not really seen anybody truly embrace, although I've pitched the idea to a couple people. But, if you, instead of just taking someone who's already voted early and like putting them on the shelf and being like, okay, we got this one in the bag. If they voted early, they're, like I said, probably hyper-partisan. They're high information. They're high propensity. There should be something we could do to activate those folks, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously this is, the people that would be willing to do something like this are complete outliers. But, in a year like this, in a presidential year with passion pretty high on both sides, I got to imagine somewhere in Florida, hopefully they're safe with this hurricane. I know that everybody's trying to hunker down there, but somewhere in Florida, there is, some nice retired lady in the Villages or something like that who loves President Trump more than life itself. And she cast her ballot literally on the first day she could. Yeah. So, why don't we try and activate her with a text or mail or digital advertising and say, hey, great, we've heard you've already voted. Can you find 5 of your friends? And then let's say they, gamify it. Like they find 5 friends and then, be creative. They find, like, maybe they take a picture of them and their friends going to vote, or they show you the I voted sticker or something like that. And maybe somebody sends them a hat or something like that. I guarantee that, and I know I can't believe I'm advocating for buying campaign swag here, but the reality is it's probably cheaper to send them a sticker or a hat if they're turning 5 votes out for you than almost any other advertising that we do. Yeah. And so I think that there is, especially, like I said, in a year like this, with the level of intensity you see on the far ends, there's a great opportunity to try and do something like that and make people feel like they're not just, I'm not just a sheep. I'm actually, a sheep herder. Right. I did my duty early and now I'm leading my friends to the promised land here.
That's a perfect use case for relational organizing, where you equip the supporters with the tools to get their friends out to vote, deep canvassing, vote tripling, all of these new voter contact methods. These are the people we need them to try because they're already committed. And it goes back to the point we were discussing earlier, which is a campaign has to be much more sophisticated today. Think about when you could have just one timeline back in the day where it's like, okay, here's when we're doing this and this. Now, not just on media where we have to all these different channels, but in terms of our messaging and our campaign strategy, we've got partisans voting early. We've got partisans who are low propensity that we want to get early. Then there's the persuadables that we're getting on election day. Your campaign just has to be so sophisticated. And I think that the answer has to be around data and automation and being able to walk and chew gum at the same time.
It's really sad that at a time when local political organizations like your county, Republican Party or something like that, or your county Democratic Party, whoever you're working for, this is a time when everybody would benefit from that institutional knowledge, of that, nice old lady at the county headquarters that lectures you that you're a young punk and you don't know what you're talking about. She probably has some fantastic institutional wisdom. There was a lady, and I will never forget her. Her name was Jeanette Moeller. She was the vice chair of the St. Joseph County, Indiana Republican Party. And I came to her all fired up in 1996 because I was doing Get Out the Vote for the first time. And I showed her what I was doing. And she took a big, long draw on that big old Virginia Slim cigarette. And she said, "Well, that's nice, honey. But you forgot this, this, and this." And then she literally schooled me on, you should be having your runners go at this time. You can do it because we were doing poll sheets back in the day, like when you would mark people off and then tear the sheet. And, she was right. She was and so we make fun of, unfortunately, sometimes the stereotypes, because a lot of times they're true, about local organizations and even state organizations. But at a time, like I said, we could really benefit from the institutional knowledge, especially when it comes to the mechanics of voting. And I'm gonna sound like I'm being a jerk here for a second. Well, heck, I do that every day. But I think there's a lot of, I'll call them people that are newer to the process, that are big fans of President Trump. That I've heard terms like, "Oh, I was red pilled," in 2017 or 2018 or whatever, which great. Hey, the more the merrier. Let's get everybody involved. But there's also all this excitement. But okay, I don't really do I just show up to the rally and wave a sign? And I'll give you a good example. In 2004, if we had a presidential rally, we would usually have obviously a VIP section for donors and stuff like that. But then you would have this other VIP section where you would have key grassroots people like, John Smith, who knocked on 1,000 doors, right, or, Gladys, who had recruited 50 volunteers or something. You'd have that type of thing. I read the other day that at one of the rallies, they had a special section set up for people that had been to more than 100 Trump rallies.
Wow.
And that parallel between the two was just really tough for an old head like me, who thinks about the logistics, the mechanics. Yeah. I was just it was just made me want to grip my teeth. And again, I don't think there's any malicious intent there. And I'm not trying to be overly critical of folks, but the nature of our campaigns now, because they grow so fast, so big, and then they're gone the next day. This is again where, because the complications, and a good, I was explaining the early vote process to a British national, a guy who's a former member of parliament. And he was just "Oh my God, it's so complicated." And I was like, "Well, yeah, but we're the biggest and the baddest democracy in the world." Well, technically India is the biggest democracy, but there's a lot at stake in our elections, a lot more than there is in almost any other country, which is why our elections are so expensive. And every time we pass a rule or a law that is supposedly helping the voters have more access, or, all the good intentions, right? "Oh yeah, we want everyone to vote." Every time we do that, we add a wrinkle and cost to the campaign process.
Right.
So I almost feel like every time somebody wants to pass a new, accessibility, or they want to expand early voting, then you should change the campaign finance, contribution limits.
I agree with that. Yeah, that's a good point.
Of course, you and I are a little biased, though. Obviously, we do this for a living.
No limits. That's my standing position. I want to say thanks to Chris Faulkner for a great conversation. Thanks for making time. I know this is a really busy season for you. Looking forward to hearing how everything goes. You can learn more about Chris and his work at the link in our show notes. If this episode made you a little bit smarter or gave you something to think about, all we ask is that you share it with a friend or colleague. You look smarter in the process. More people hear about the show. It's a win-win all around. You can subscribe to the Campaign Trend podcast wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. And our website is at campaigntrend.com for even more. With that, I'll say thanks for listening. See you next time.
The Campaign Trend podcast is produced by Advocacy Content Kitchen, a media production studio.